Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Jenkins. So here we are. This is going to be part 2 of the bone lecture. So in part 1, when we met in person, we reviewed the structure of the bone. We talked about bone marrow. We talked about bone cells, types of bones, bone growth. We ended by talking about the strength of the diaphysis versus the epiphysis, if you recall. Let's go with red for today. So remember, we said that the diaphysis, which is the central shaft of a long bone, which is made up mostly of that compact bone, is very strong to compression type forces, but relatively weaker from side to side. We get our side to side strength from the epiphyses, because that contains the spongy bone, where the trabeculi, or unorganized network of spongy bone tissue, can lay down in the line of stress. So it is the epiphysis that is much stronger to torsion or twisting forces, but weak in compression. Okay, so in this part 2, we're going to talk more about loads on bone, how bone tissue handles different types of loads. We're going to talk about bone healing, some about bone injuries, and then we're going to talk about examples of how this might relate to sport or activity, as this is kinesiology and we're studying human movement, and that's what sport and activity involves. So we're going to pick up in the notes in your outline, right under Roman numeral 3, response to stress. So we can see letter B, effects of loads. So there's a pretty simple law, maybe you've heard of it before, but it has the name of Wolff's Law. And all that says is bone grows and remodels in response to the stress placed upon it. It's kind of obvious, but it's important that we point it out. We know that we initially lay down bone up until adolescence to help bone, through adolescence, to help bone grow in length. But even after growth in length is over, we still remodel bone tissue, remember? So we talked about the activity of osteoblasts. We may recall osteoblasts build bone. And then we have the osteoclasts, which break down bone. Maybe the average bone cell lives for like 7 years, I don't know. If the average bone cell lives 7 years, then that bone cell, after 7 years, dies off. The osteoclasts break it down, and then we have to have an osteoblast to build it back. So as a healthy adult, you want the osteoblast activity to, for the most part, equal the osteoclast activity. So whatever old bone tissue or damaged, injured bone tissue, whatever of that old or damaged bone tissue is broken down, we've replaced the same amount with new bone from osteoblasts. Well, as this bone is laid down, and we kind of talked about this when we talked about the unorganized network of spongy bone in the epiphysis. So as that bone is remodeled, it can lay down in the line of stress. So that's an example of Wolff's Law. As bone remodels, it lays down in the line of stress. The example I gave in class was a weightlifter doing power lift type motions where there's a lot of stress and load that way. So bone is going to remodel in the line of stress. That's an effect of Wolff's Law. It can also relate to injury. So following injury, we want to be careful to rest the injured area enough to let it heal. But then once we get later in the healing process, we actually want to apply a little bit of stress so that that new bone tissue gets laid down in the line of stress. That's an example of Wolff's Law. I will end by giving kind of a sad example, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's a real demonstration of Wolff's Law. You know, back in the day, hundreds of years ago, in Chinese culture, small feet were viewed as beautiful, so They used to bind young women's feet into really small shoes. And as the bone would remodel or grow, because they would do this to young children, the bones would grow in response to the foot binding, and they would not be able to grow in length because they were put in a shoe that was too small. Really sad. But that's an example of Wolff's Law. Okay, our good old friend, the load deformation curve. So if we're talking about effects of loads, what are the effects of different loads, compression, etc., on bone tissue? Well, we just said that bone tissue will grow and remodel in response to the types of loads or stress placed upon it. And what we're going to be doing with every tissue, so as we go through this beginning part of the course, we're going to talk about bone, as we are now. Then we're going to talk about muscle. We'll be able to talk about ligaments, which is a little bit different, right? It's the connective tissue, different from bone or different from muscle. For each of these tissue types, we're going to lay out the load deformation curve, how that specific tissue responds to loads. I just took a drink there. I'm sorry. I'm hydrating. So I'll tell you this. Bone tissue demonstrates the normal load deformation curve. In other words, this is what I introduced to you in chapter 2. So it's the same shape. This is the load deformation curve for bone. Later, other tissues look a little bit different. So we'll get there when we get there. But for now, I just want to remind you that the load deformation curve for bone looks like this. And let's point out again, what are some of the primary characteristics of the load deformation curve for bone? Well, we're going to see that it has a pretty small... Oh, hold on here. I'm looking at my notes to make sure that I'm telling you, because I want to make sure I'm telling you what I'm going to put on the test here. Okay. So the load deformation curve for bone shows that it has some elastic region. So it's like small to moderate. Small to moderate, and it has some plastic region, a little bit more. But overall, here are the things that I want you to take away. First of all, you should know what it looks like, right? That it has this shape to it, right? Other things to look at. We should remember that bone has some elasticity. Obviously, not as much elasticity as a ligament, but a ligament is meant to stretch more. So it has some elasticity. And we remember that maybe people don't realize that with bone, but because of the spongy bone at the ends of the bone can have a little give to it. If we apply compressive loads, bone will give a little. It's a little flexible. So some people forget that, right? And actually, even though it may not be demonstrated in this picture, it has a relatively small plastic region. I know that it's bigger than the elastic region, but we'll understand this better when we get to the other tissues. So that's why I'm purposely writing out here what I would like you to know. Bone, we may remind ourselves, has some give, a little bit of flexibility to it. It has a relatively small plastic region. What that means is there's not a big timeline between when there's some deformation and ultimate failure. So we may remember that in the elastic region, the tissue may bend a little, but it returns to the original shape. Okay, so in the elastic region, tissue may give or bend a little, but it returns to the original shape. In the plastic region, when that load is applied, it gives or it bends, but it doesn't go back to its original resting position, which is another way of saying there's some deformation that's permanent. Right? So in the elastic region, we apply a stress, it has a little give, and it returns to the resting shape. In the plastic region, we have a little bit of deformation, bend, and there's some permanent lasting effect of that. It bends, but it doesn't go back to the original resting position. And then ultimately, we apply so much load that it eventually fails or fractures. In this case, the ultimate failure point is a bone fracture. So what this is telling us is there's a period of time where bone will bend, but it will return to its original resting length. We love that. But between the yield point is where we now have permanent damage. There's not a big difference in time before we start to have permanent deformation to bone fracture. I think you can understand that. If we take a bone, think of the femur, and if you apply a compressive load, imagine the femur in a vice grip, and we're applying a compressive load. It'll bend a little bit, but then all of a sudden there's a short period of time before we get to the point where it bends and there'll be permanent damage to when it breaks. Right? It doesn't take long. Once you reach a more significant point, there's not much time before it all of a sudden breaks. So the distance between the plastic region and the failure point is small. That's why we say it has a relatively small plastic region. Once you pass the yield point, it doesn't take long until it just fractures. This is different from a ligament, which is meant to be able to stretch more, larger plastic region. We may even have some stretch where it leads to some permanent damage, but it still is able to hold on and maintain its ligament shape. Not so much for bone. Once you pass the yield point, it doesn't take much more load before we have ultimate failure. So if you know the 3 points I have on the right, you will do well. All right, the next thing on here is bone healing. And I just want to remind you of some of the basic steps. And you might be wondering, well, this isn't a rehabilitation class. No, it's not. But we still need to talk about it because it is a characteristic of bone tissue and how it responds to load. Because sometimes we have a load that's so great, just like we talked about here, sometimes we have a load that's so great that there is ultimate failure and it fractures, it breaks. So to really fully understand the tissue, we have to talk about how that tissue responds when we get to that ultimate failure point. I'm sure you've had this before in anatomy and physiology. The basic idea. So when we have a bone fracture, there used to be a continuous bone, right? It's a really bad bone. But now there's some type of fracture. There's an interruption to that bone tissue. Well, the first thing that's going to happen is a hematoma forms, which is just another way of saying there's swelling. That's true of any tissue damage. It's our body's natural response to protect it so you don't damage it further, to bring in supplies needed for healing and remove waste. We are then going to form a fibrocartilaginous callus, which just means that we start to fill in the gap with fibrocartilage. If we think back to how bone was formed in the first place, we talked about bone formation. I gave you there's two ways that bones initially form in the body. Intramembranous ossification, which is only the bones of the skull and the clavicles. And intramembranous ossification is bone growth through a fibrous membrane. You didn't really have to know the steps of that. But the more common way that bones initially grow is through endochondral ossification, bone growth through a cartilage model. So what's cool about the body, sometimes it just does what it already does, already knows how to do. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. We knew how this bone developed in the first place. So when there's tissue damage, and we reach ultimate failure, there's swelling, and then we're going to fill in that gap with cartilage. That's what we did when we first built bone. We had cartilage making up the tissue, and here we're going to initially just refill it with cartilage. It's going to take time to rebuild that new bone tissue, so in the meantime, it's kind of like putting a Band-Aid on something. In the meantime, we fill it with cartilage, which is going to give some structure to that damaged area. And over time, we replace that cartilage with bone. And what do you notice? We're always going to lay down spongy bone first. And then, if appropriate, it will be converted to compact bone. So you should know these steps. When there's any kind of fracture of bone, no matter how big or small that break is, there's swelling. Then we temporarily fill in the injured area with cartilage. And then, over time, we replace the cartilage with bone, just like we did in endochondral ossification when the bone was grown in the first place. Of course, the bone tissue we lay down initially is spongy bone. And then if it's an area of compact bone, we will then replace the spongy bone with compact bone. This part here is where we actually want to use Wolff's Law to our benefit. You know, if you are into rehabilitation, whether you're going in to be some kind of rehab career or you've been injured yourself, in the first part here, you know, in this phase of bone healing, we mostly just want to rest the area. A lot of times we immobilize it. I mean, it makes sense. We just fractured the tissue. If we move it around now, we're going to have disruption to these bony edges. We don't want that. It's injured. We need to immobilize it, not make it any worse. Let the body do its job. But once we filled it in with cartilage, and once we start to replace it with spongy and then compact bone, here is where we want to do some stress. So this is the case where we start to apply some stress. And of course, it depends on the severity of the fracture, the location of the body, but the idea is, as the body is laying down bone tissue, we want to deliberately start applying a little bit of load or stress. You know this. You have your foot, your fracture to your foot, you put it in a cast for a little bit to let it rest, immobilize, but then you take the cast off. We start to do some rehab. We do some non-weight bearing exercises. So we improve blood flow to the area. We're applying a little bit of stress. Then we start to adding maybe some TheraBand, and you're doing some dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, inversion, eversion lightly with the TheraBand to apply some stress. As time goes on, you apply more stress. Maybe you start to have partial weight bearing, and then you develop to more weight bearing. But the idea is we do that because we want the bone tissue to lay down in the line of stress. If we had it immobilized the whole time, the bone would lay down kind of haphazard, and it wouldn't be as strong. Good stuff. Okay, I would like you to know some of the types of fractures. First of all, a fracture is just a disruption in bone tissue. Fracture is the same thing as a break. Some people tend to think that a fracture maybe is less severe, but a break is more severe. In the scientific way, a break and a fracture means the same thing. It's an interruption of bone tissue. But then you can go on to describe it more. I would only like you to know a couple. I would like you to know a non-displaced versus displaced fracture. See, it's in bold. Non-displaced means that when the bone is fractured, the ends stay aligned. It's non-displaced. The bone edges are not displaced. They're still aligned. That was the example here, right? We have a fracture, but the bone edges, even though they're separated, they're still in alignment. Versus a displaced fracture, the bone edges are no longer aligned. That would be more severe. This top right picture is a femur fracture. I mean, that's a big, heavy bone. That type of fracture is probably only going to happen because of a car accident or skiing. You need really extreme loads to cause that to happen. You should know what a stress fracture is, and that's just a really tiny fracture. Oftentimes on an x-ray, you can't even see a stress fracture because it's such a small little, it's almost like a micro fracture. It's common maybe on the calcaneus or heel. You might get it in the near the head of the femur, maybe on the anterior crest of the tibia from shin splints over time that get worse, that develop into a tiny, tiny fracture. This here is a bone scan. Maybe you've seen it. Because stress fractures are so small, they're not easily seen on an x-ray, so they might do a bone scan. And in a bone scan, the stress fractures show up as those little hot spots. So let me ask you, what type of force do you think would cause these? And what I mean by that is, let's go here. Would it be a macro trauma or a micro trauma? Macro is one big load trauma. Micro is many, many small. Well, of course, this is more likely the result of a macro trauma, and it's likely acute. Like I said, a car accident, big forces. Skiing accident, you're going downhill, twisting, contortion, big forces. And it's more likely to be acute. Whereas a stress fracture, it's a micro trauma. The actual stresses in themselves are not as big, but we have many, many, many micro traumas over time. So these tend to be chronic. This would be like the runner who's running on pavement over and over and over again. Each individual trauma is not that large in severity, but over time, that micro trauma over time can lead to a fracture. I'd also like you to know an avulsion fracture. An avulsion fracture is when bone is torn away or it's avulsed. Oftentimes, this is the result of a ligament tear. So in this picture here, this is the elbow. Commonly, let's say we have the ulnar collateral ligament. Well, if that ligament tears, right, that ligament gets torn and it might pull a piece of bone off with it. So an avulsion fracture means a piece of bone is pulled off, a tension force. Commonly the result of a ligament tear. That ligament tears, and it's such a forceful tear that where that ligament attaches on the bone, it pulls a piece of bone off with it. And then a spiral fracture, this is the last one I'd like you to know. A spiral fracture has a spiral look to it. There it is. And this is going to be the result of some kind of torsion force or twisting. This is a torsion fracture, a spiral fracture, kind of looks like a corkscrew. This is of the fibula in the lower leg. Common when maybe someone plants their foot and then changes direction. That would be a twisting force. They plant their foot and then their body moves the other direction, but their foot stays. You should be reviewing everything that I'm talking about, and particularly in this case, writing on the screen here. Here are some pictures that show the steps of healing. Don't need to worry about it. Sometimes if there's a fracture and the bone is small, or the bone is fractured into so many pieces, you might want to put a rod or a screw in to help keep the bone together, so the bone can be together while it's healing. Make sure you know what osteoporosis is. I think you've heard about this, right? Osteoporosis is when we have low bone density. More common in older individuals, particularly older women. In this case, we have a lot of osteoclast activity. We're breaking down a lot of old tissue and lower osteoblast activity. We're breaking down a lot of bone and the body's not as fast at rebuilding it. So we have an imbalance. And as a result of not being able to keep up with building new bone, the overall result is a lower bone density. On the left, healthy, spongy bone. On the left, healthy, spongy bone. On the right would be osteoporotic bone. Less dense, weaker, more prone to resulting in fractures, all those sorts of things. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about something that would be specific to female athletes. Now, as it turns out, the term female athlete triad has gone a little bit out of favor. So even 10 years ago, we actually used this term more. Certainly 15, 20 years ago, it was something that we were just learning about. So now you might not see this phrase as often. We've developed some new terminology like low energy availability, which is LEA, low energy availability. But I still think, as an introduction, I think it's useful to just talk about how these three conditions can be related to each other. Certainly disordered eating and osteoporosis can happen in anyone. They are both more common in the female sex. Of course, menstrual dysfunction is only possible in those who are menstruating, women. But all I want to point out here is that these three things can be related. If someone, particularly a younger female, adolescent or younger adult, it's more common, have some sort of disordered eating pattern. It may not necessarily be diagnosable anorexia or bulimia, but if they're just not eating enough, or they're not eating enough of the right things. Think about an adolescent female. At puberty, females are going to go through a very significant hormonal change, and they're going to experience a big increase in estrogen as well as progesterone. And that has all sorts of effects. It increases fat deposition. So at puberty, women all of a sudden start to have fat where they didn't have it before. And for a young female athlete, that's really hard to deal with, especially when you think about that young female athlete looking at their male counterparts who during their puberty are experiencing a rapid increase in testosterone. For males going through puberty, they will see a 20-fold increase in testosterone. So the male athletes are just getting taller, getting stronger. They're really starting to excel. Meanwhile, the female in adolescence are starting to lay down more fat. And obviously that's going to make them a little bit, perhaps, less successful at sport. And it's really hard. I'm a female. I was there going through puberty. So it's hard physically and it's hard mentally. So it's a very common thing for female athletes to start to not eat as much. Oh my God, all this fat is being laid down, which is normal because the estrogen and progesterone is preparing the body to carry a baby, and we need to have more fat in order to do that, to support it, protect it, and feed it. But boy, it's really hard, and you might not want to eat as much because you might think, well, if I don't eat as much, maybe I won't have as much fat deposition. right? At this time also, women have wider hips, so some of their motor control is not as good. Some of their, when they jump and land, because of the wider hips, there's more of a valgus or increased middle force to the knees, making them more prone to injury. And there's this whole transition period where they may not have as good motor skills for a period of time, and their male counterparts in adolescence are just excelling. So it's a really easy situation to eat less. And that's just a time when they should be continuing to eat so they can actually mature their body. So it may not be diagnosable anorexia or bulimia, but they certainly may eat less. As someone eats less, it is certainly related. It can lead to poorer bone health. It may not lead to actually diagnosable osteoporosis, but if you're not eating as much, you might have a lower bone density. If you're not giving the bones the supplies it needs, they're not going to be as strong. More likely to have a stress fracture. Stress fractures are very common in adolescent, especially endurance athletes, gymnasts, who have those repetitive micro traumas. They're not eating enough. Think about gymnasts and endurance athletes like runners. Isn't it better to be skinny? For gymnastics, you want to be able to move and contort your body. So if you're too big, that's harder. Gymnastics is somewhat of a subjective sport, so you have to look good. For endurance, for runners, you want to be skinny because it's less weight you have to move as you run. But if you don't eat enough, your bones aren't going to be able to stay as strong. You're more likely to have a stress fracture. If you're not eating as much, it can also lead to menstrual dysfunction. Have you ever talked to someone? I'm going to spell this wrong. I think it just has one M. I want to make sure I try and get this right. There's something called amenorrhea, which is when the period stops. I can speak for myself as an Ironman athlete. The first time I trained for an Ironman, I lost my period. I mean, I was in my 20s, late 20s, but I was putting so much stress on my body and I wasn't eating enough. So what happens is the female body just doesn't have enough energy to do it all, right? There's not enough energy to keep on the menstrual cycle, developing the egg in the ovary over time. It takes a lot of energy, right? Preparing the uterus for the fertilized egg takes a lot of energy. But if you don't have enough nutrients coming in and you're working out a lot, there's just not enough energy. So the body may purposely shut down the menstrual cycle. And that's telling you something, right? So it's not really a good thing. And of course, if you're to the point where you're no longer menstruating, that also means that you're probably going to have poor bone health because you don't have enough nutrients. So they're all related. That's all I want to say. By the way, once a female athlete starts to eat better and have enough energy, the period comes back in almost every instance. But certainly over time, it can have permanent consequences. Just know what the three components are and that they can be related to each other. Okay, so you can see here, the last part of this chapter, I just want to talk about some examples in sport and activity that relate to bones. Now, as you're going to see in some of these chapters, I'm going to give you some more specific examples. Of course, I would never ask you to memorize all these specific things, but sometimes it gives us a nice practical application. And as you can see here, sometimes I do have things in red that I would like you to know. So, okay, so a lot of this information comes from a book called The Sports Gene. Something on my slide there. Okay, so in terms of bones and athletes, I think you know this. Anybody who's familiar with athletics is probably familiar with the fact that sports have become more specialized. It used to be that athletes would play 3 sports a year, right? Someone would play football, basketball, baseball, for example. But now, as people are more interested in doing well, to have a better video to send to college recruiters to get that scholarship, blah, 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 they tend to specialize more. Now they're only playing football. Now in the springtime, they're playing spring football. They're on a 7-versus-7 league. They're going off to camps all summer. So as we become more specialized, it has effects on the body. I will say that the trend is slowing a little. It still happens a lot, but I think as the research comes out, what it's showing is people tend to be actually stronger in their body if they play more sports, especially throughout adolescence. If you only play one sport, you're only providing that one type of stress, and it may not make the body as strong overall and well-rounded. But of course, people will argue, and to some extent they're correct, that when you start to play multiple sports, it takes away your time to be able to really focus on and improve your skills in the one. But what I want to point out is, as we've had more specialization, people are only playing one sport, it has had an impact on the body. So look at this thing here. In the last 30 years, the average elite female gymnast height has gone down. So what's happening is, as more and more young kids specialize in gymnastics, and that's a sport where you really have to specialize young, right? Because you're going to reach your peak younger. So it's important to really specialize young if that's what you want to do. And to be honest with you, to be a really high elite level gymnast, you probably have to specialize, right? But it has effects on the bones. Applying those certain stresses, and because sometimes being shorter is beneficial, someone who is a gymnast, particularly here a female gymnast who is shorter, has a lower center of gravity and has more stability, so they have better balance. But it's affecting their bone growth over time. You don't need to know the exact numbers, but just that, it's shrunk over time. You can see here at the bottom, in other sports, being taller is more beneficial. According to this book, in the 1 year that he was studying, 1 more centimeter in height or extra 6.5 pounds of weight translated into more money, because usually you're better in football. So again, just giving you some examples of how bone tissue, bone growth, bone remodeling, specialization, how we can see this examples in sport. So one example was specialization. Okay, here are some other things. So look at the tennis players here. This is a result, right? So a tennis player is also someone who likely specializes, right? So we're still talking about specialization. To be really good at tennis, you really got to start young, most of the time, and you're playing tennis year-round, let's be honest. Well, look, the dominant forearm bones of elite tennis players grew longer on their dominant side, right? Your dominant side, you're holding the racket, you're doing more. You might have a two-hand backhand where you help a little bit with the other hand, but as a result of more stress, if this person is doing this before or during adolescence, their bones grow longer. It's kind of interesting. You can read about some of the bone characteristics of really elite swimmers. Women tend to have, of course, wider hips than males, but what we find is female elite swimmers actually, along all females, tend to have narrower hips. That's more beneficial to be more aerodynamic through water. Look at Michael Phelps. By the way, in this book, David Epstein talks about Michael Phelps as the prototypical structure of what you would want for a successful swimmer. Again, I'm not going to ask you these, it's not in red, but look, he has a longer trunk and shorter legs. So look, he's really tall, right, but only wore a 32-inch length. So that's actually beneficial, right? By having a longer trunk, he's going to have longer arms, which means that every time he does a stroke, he can move more water, push him along farther. Okay, the next part here, and it's written in there, letter B, how much can bone structure change? Well, as we've talked about, these changes are structurally small. I mean, we said what? The tennis forearm bones increased 1/4 of an inch. Is that what it was? So that's really relatively small in the whole scheme of things. So the changes in bone structure in one lens are relatively small in terms of measurement, but that small, relatively measurably small change leads to a considerable difference in their success in that sport. So we don't need much of a big change to make a difference. It may not seem like much, but 1/4 of an inch longer forearm bone can yield a much more forceful tennis hit. You increase the lever arm, which means you can generate more power. So even though it's small in terms of measurement sake of what we think of, it can actually yield pretty considerable changes. You can see at the bottom here, there are limits. The body, in terms of muscles and bones, there's a limit to how much it can improve or how much it can handle. So I just wanted to say there are limits. This is not something that we can change a lot always. But you can see there are limits, and you can read about that if you like. Okay. In lab, we're going to measure wingspan. So we'll do it in lab. I'm going to bring in a tape measure. Wingspan is basically the measurement of, if you put your arms out to the side, so they're parallel to the ground, the measurement from the longest finger here to the longest finger there. And we compare that to the overall height of the person, from top of their head to the feet. The average wingspan is around 1. Do I have that on the next slide here? No. The average wingspan is around 1. And that just is a ratio that tells us that your height is more or less equal to the distance that you can spread your arms out. However, there's a bit of a self-selection bias here. Wouldn't it be more beneficial for NBA players to have a wider wingspan? Well, of course, they can block more shots, they can dunk the ball easier, all those sorts of things. When David Epstein did this research, way back in 2010, 2011, so I know it's been a while, but only 2 players had wingspans that were under 1.0. There were only 2 players in all of the NBA in which their arm wingspan was not greater than their height, right? Here are 2 examples. I know this is old school, but relatively, this is this is very short for an NBA player, but look at his wingspan, right? Whew. So we'll measure that in lab. We can see that, as I gave you an example with the NFL, we also have an example with the NBA. The taller you are, better. The greater your wingspan, better. And when you're better, you can make more money. Okay. So that ends this chapter. Make sure you're reviewing what I talked about or what was in red. We have an exam coming up. Reach out to me, okay? I know I'm not going to see you. I see you on Monday if you have lab, but I'm not going to see you if you're in the Thursday lab section. Don't hesitate to reach out. Send me an email, schedule a Zoom call. I'm here to help. All right, folks, good luck.